T2 was at the store with his mother, and his mom was looking at this bracelet, which she couldn't afford. And T2 sensed his mom wanted the bracelet, and in an odd show of affection for his mother, he turned to the shopkeeper, this little tiny kid who's not even 3 years old yet, and he tells the shopkeeper that if he doesn't give this bracelet to his mother for free, T2 will shoot and kill the shopkeeper. In December of 1986, a woman named Shanti Singh was sitting on her bed cradling her toddler son, whose name was T2, as he threw a huge temper tantrum. And Shanti knew her son's constant wailing must be annoying her neighbors in the little rural village in northern India where they lived, because T2 threw these tantrums all the time for seemingly no reason. Shanti and her husband had taken T2 to the local doctor, and the doctor said, "I can't find anything wrong with him, so whatever's causing him to be so upset, it's gotta be psychological." Shanti grabbed her son and tried to give him a hug and kiss to get him to calm down. T2 turned around and kicked her and punched her, and so Shanti had to kind of fall back on the bed, and T2 at this point leapt off the bed and ran out of the room. As Shanti was laying there on the bed, practically crying from frustration, she heard a plate break in the kitchen. Clearly, T2 had smashed it on purpose. And so Shanti grabbed him, she put him into his room, and then shut the door, and then at some point, Shanti heard her son start to say something that typically signaled the end of a tantrum. T2, in the bedroom, began saying the word Shirsh Verma, which actually was a nonsense word. And so on the one hand, she's thinking, okay, this tantrum's about to end, but on the other, she's like, it's obviously connected in some way to what's going on with my son, but I have no idea what it means. And so Shanti began yelling through the door at T2 to explain what Shirsh Verma meant, but T2 had no explanation. He just kept saying the word over and over again, Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma. Shanti and her husband had 5 other kids. T2 was the youngest, and T2 was not like any of his other siblings. But it wasn't until T2 began talking at around 2 years old that Shanti and her husband really started to become worried. Basically, T2 would say things that seemed to indicate that he genuinely hated everyone in his family. Now, for context, Shanti and her family were not poor, but they weren't rich either. They lived in a little concrete home, they didn't have a TV or a car, and T2 had never known anything different. This was his life from the day he was born. But when he learned to speak at around 2 years old, it was like all T2 wanted to talk about was how crappy of a lifestyle their family lived. For example, when T2's mom, Shanti, would put on one of her saris that happened to be ripped — a sari is a traditional garment in India — T2 would look at what she was wearing, and in toddler speak, he would tell her that she looked terrible and that it looked like she was just wearing rags. T2 would also walk around their house, and he would point to spots in the house that looked dirty, and he would demand that somebody cleaned it up because he didn't want to live in a dirty house. And then whenever the family needed to go somewhere and they would walk there or take the bus there, T2 would complain the entire time that he wanted to be in a car, despite the fact that T2 basically had never used a car before. But perhaps the strangest aspect of T2's behavior was around the time he began talking and insulting his family, he also began talking about this very historic city called Agra, which was located about 8 miles away from where they lived. But T2 had never been to Agra, and there was no reason he would be drawn to Agra. Starting around the time T2 began talking at 2 years old, he began asking to go to Agra several times a week. And when his parents would say, no, we're not going to go to Agra, T2 would throw a huge tantrum. Shortly after, T2 was at the store with his mother, and his mom was looking at this bracelet, which she couldn't afford. And T2 sensed his mom wanted the bracelet, and in an odd show of affection for his mother, he turned to the shopkeeper, this little tiny kid who's not even 3 years old yet, and he tells the shopkeeper that if he doesn't give this bracelet to his mother for free, T2 will shoot and kill the shopkeeper. But what really just unsettled Shanti the most about her son's behavior was that nonsense word that T2 kept saying at the end of all of his tantrums. Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma. Fast forward to that day after he's broken the plate and now Shanti's put him in his room, T2 began saying that nonsense word, except he was getting a little bit older and his speech was getting a little bit more clear. And so as Shanti was laying up against the door, she realized that her son was not saying a single word, Shirsh Verma, he was saying 2 words. They were Suresh Varma. She thought it sounded like a name, but it was a name she had never heard before. A few months after the dish-breaking incident, in April of 1987, all of T2's very strange, erratic, terrible behaviors would erupt all at once. That April day started out like any other. Shanti made breakfast for her family, and then her husband headed out to do some errands, and her 6 children kind of dispersed around the inside and outside of the house, but T2 was really grouchy, and so he stayed inside in the kitchen with Shanti. A little while later, Shanti's oldest son came into the kitchen, and he asked his mother, hey, when will Dad get back from his trip to Agra? And so when Shanti's oldest son said the word Agra, T2 just got up, left the kitchen, and he went to his room, he grabbed a couple of things, and then he came back into the kitchen carrying this bundle of clothes with him, and he walked right past his brother and his mother. He went out the front door and began running down the road without saying a word. And the oldest son just turned and began running out of the house to catch up with T2. And then when the older brother got T2 back inside, T2 was completely inconsolable. He was throwing a huge temper tantrum. He was on the ground kicking and flailing and screaming at the top of his lungs. But eventually he did kind of calm down, and he began saying Suresh Verma over and over again. But then he began talking about something that he really hadn't brought up before. T2 also began talking about some radio store in Agra. And T2 kept saying, why didn't Dad bring me to the radio store? Why didn't he bring me? And so as Shanti is listening to her son, she suddenly thinks he's being so specific about this radio store, maybe this is my opportunity to lean in and learn what the heck is going on with my kid. Once T2 had left the room, Shanti turned to her oldest son and she told him to go to Agra right now, just go there and look for a radio store or something that could be a clue to what's going on with T2. So the oldest son left the house and he went to one of his friends' houses who had a car, and together they drove into Agra. A few hours later, when Shanti's oldest son returned from Agra, he came into their home with a very serious look on his face. And so Shanti asked her oldest son, tell me, what did you learn? What happened in Agra? And the oldest son, he looked down for a second, and then he looked back at his mom and he just said, tomorrow, we're going to have visitors. The next day, a car pulled up in front of Shanti's home and 6 people climbed out. There was a woman wearing a beautiful red sari who appeared to be in her 30s, and then there were 3 other men, and there was also an older couple. It was clear just from the way they looked, they were from somewhere else and they had a ton of money. So when Shanti saw this group of 6 very well-off people were standing right outside of their gate, she called for T2 and said, hey, go outside and open the gate for our guests. And so T2, he opens up the door and he sees these 6 people, and suddenly Shanti heard T2 make a sound that he never made. It was like the sound of pure joy. He was so elated to see these 6 people. Shanti couldn't believe it. Just then, Shanti heard T2 from outside yelling for Shanti and the rest of his family to come outside and meet his other family. Shanti went to the door and gestured for the guests to come inside, and then after they were all seated, Shanti looked over at her son, T2, and she saw he had this huge grin on his face. He was so happy, and he was staring intently at the woman who got out of the car, who was in her 30s and wearing the beautiful red sari, and she was sitting right across the table from T2, and T2 is just locked on her. At this point, nobody is speaking, and in this kind of tense and awkward silence, T2, he eventually breaks the silence, the 3-year-old child, and he asks the woman in red to come sit next to him. And so the woman in the red sari, she does what he asks and moves over and sits next to the toddler. And then T2 looked up at her and he smiled and he said, do you know who I am? And the woman, she's looking down at him and she said, no, I don't. And T2 would look back up at her and he would say, I know who you are. You're Uma. And at this, the woman in red, whose name really was Uma, she gasped. She had no idea how this kid knew who she was. But before she could even say anything, T2 continued. Hey, do you remember when we went to the fair with Ranu and Sanu and I bought you those sweets? Uma, instead of looking like she was just kind of shocked and appalled that this random kid knew who she was, now it was like a look of shocked recognition as she's looking down at T2, like she suddenly understood what was actually going on. And at the same time, T2's mother, Shanti, was watching this happen and she was kind of piecing together what was really going on here, and suddenly she realized she needed to check something. And she got up and she ran out of the room and she came back with scissors and began cutting all the hair off his head that was kind of drooped over his right ear. And as the hair on T2's head fell to the ground, exposing more and more of the right side of his head, all the adults watching just gasped. And the whole time, T2 was just smiling. To understand what just happened, you need some context. So here's what happened when Shanti's oldest son was sent to Agra. At some point, they drove past one of the many radio stores in Agra, and the name of this radio store immediately stood out to the brother and this friend. And inside of there is where they met Uma. And when the older brother asked Uma how this radio shop got its name, Uma would tell the older brother that this radio shop actually belonged to her husband. Except 3.5 years ago, he was murdered. The name of the shop was Suresh Radio Shop. Her husband's name was Suresh Verma. The two words that Titu would say all the time at the end of his tantrums. Many people, including professors from major universities in India and America, have come to believe that what happened with Titu was when Suresh was murdered, his spirit somehow came out of his body and entered Titu's body. Basically, Suresh was reincarnated in Titu. The reincarnation theory would explain the two very unique and very pronounced birthmarks that Titu had right next to his right ear. He had one right above his right ear and right below it. Suresh Verma was shot in the side of his head, and the bullet went in above his right ear and then came out on the bottom part of his right ear. After this discovery, Shanti and her husband and the rest of her family expected Titu to want to live with Uma and his other family. And at first, that is what Titu wanted to do, but pretty quickly he actually decided that, you know what, I want to stay put with the family I was born into, and we can just visit with the other family. His bad behavior basically went away, and he became a normal, high-functioning kid, and Titu has grown up and become a very happy and successful adult. He's got a family of his own, and he's currently a professor at a college in India.